adjusting the online sound. So.
Yes. All right. I think everyone in the room here to people online here. I've got multiple amplification devices. I've got an in-room one here, and I've got the online one here. So, many microphones. Oh. Okay. That's like,
I need to turn so that the speakers in the group.
Yes, can everyone hear me? Is this getting feedback into the room anymore? Are we still hearing that? No, I don't think so. Okay. Okay, do we think we're good? Yes? Still unsure, or can we, what do we think? Oh, now I'm still hearing the feedback, yeah. No. Yeah, I think what's happening is the Zoom is feeding back into the room. So, okay, let's see if that is working. Is this feeding back into the room? There's a little bit of a delay, so I guess I'll just keep talking and see if we hear it. Did anyone hear anything? I think we're okay. Okay. Does it seem all right? Okay, great. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for your patience, and thanks to everyone for coming out today. Very grateful to be here. Especially want to express my thanks to all of the folks at NTU who have made my visit possible. And most especially to my host, Professor Wee, who has been very generous in bringing me here, doing a lot of work to get me here, but also being a wonderful host in what is actually my very first visit to Singapore. So I've been really excited to experience the place, get to know the place, and one thing I'll actually try to, hold on a second. So actually, one thing I will try to focus on towards the tail end of the presentation is to think a little bit about how some of the material I'm presenting might look a bit different in the setting of Singapore. And how does this framework of Asian diaspora that I'm going to try to explain a bit today and develop a bit today, how does it look when we bring it outside the United States and into a space like Singapore? Does the concept of Asian diaspora work here in Singapore? Does it not work? Is a different kind of framework needed? Does it connect American and sort of international contexts? So those are some of the questions I'll try to raise towards the end of the presentation. And I'll be very eager to hear your thoughts and your feedback about how, if at all, you think this framework functions in this space and whether it kind of requires adjustments when we think about the space of Singapore. Okay. Hmm. Okay. can just advance on the computer if that's all right. Oh, it's not advancing on the computer either. Sorry, we've got more technical issues. Just hang on just a second. Huh. No, it's not advancing on the computer keyboard either. That is odd. Is it because Zoom's on? Okay, there we go. Let's see if it works now. Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. All right, we are ready to go. So just a quick outline of what I hope to cover this afternoon. I may well not get to all of these topics. So basically what I'm going to do is try to sketch out the concept of Asian diaspora that I'm interested in and that I developed in my book, Diasporic Poetics. I'll spend most of the first half of the talk kind of sketching that idea out, talking about how it relates to sort of earlier paradigms of Asian American studies, as well as how it relates to paradigms of Asian studies, particularly as practiced in the United States. So I'll talk a bit about the current state of Asian diaspora studies and the way it may function as a possible bridge between Asian and Asian American studies. I'll then talk about some possible limitations of this concept of Asian diaspora. I keep realizing I'm so accustomed to having look over my shoulder at the presentation, but it's actually right here in front of me, so I don't have to do that. One thing I'm particularly interested in is the way in, as I'm going to suggest, that Asian diaspora is a contradictory formation. In other words, different parts may not seem to go together in certain ways, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that. I'll then move on to talk about why poetics in particular seems like a very fruitful and useful place to explore the concept of Asian diaspora. Following that, I'm going to offer a few possible case studies of Asian diasporic poetics. And this is where, depending on sort of time, I may or may not get to all of these three case studies, but these are case studies that are taken from a number of different national locations. So the Korean-American author Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha, author of Dictée, Ouyang Yu, a poet originally from China who works in Australia, and the Asian-Canadian writer Fred Waugh. And then finally, I'll close by asking what it looks like to bring the concept of the Asian diaspora to Asia, and in particular to a site like Singapore, and how this concept might kind of resonate differently in a different kind of space. I'm going to try to not spend more than, say, I'd like to make sure we have plenty of time for conversation and discussion. So I'd like to talk probably for, maybe 45 minutes or so, and then open up things for discussion. I may also pause during the lecture and invite questions or comments. And please do feel free to raise your hand or ask questions during the presentation if there's anything that comes up that you'd like more clarification on. So I want to start with this quotation from the Asian American scholar Saling Wong, one of the kind of leading scholars of Asian American literature who in the 1990s was kind of one of the pioneers of studying Asian American literature. This quotation is from an essay by Wong called Denationalization Reconsidered. This is an essay that she wrote in the mid-1990s, and it's become a very influential touchstone not just for a lot of Asian American scholars, but I think for scholars who think about transnationalism and diaspora more broadly. And the quotation is this: "The concept of Asian Americans is one that doesn't travel well." Now, what does Wang mean by this? The larger context of this article is that Wang is looking at what she perceives to be a kind of major sea change in Asian American studies. And that is that Asian American has kind of historically been a category that understandably sort of stops at the boundaries of the United States. It's a concept that's had its origins in the history of Asian immigrants to the US, kind of developed through the civil rights fights of the 1960s and 1970s, and so seems like a concept that really functions best within the borders of the United States. But Wang asks, well, okay, if we start to move towards a conception that kind of moves beyond the boundaries of the United States, does the concept Asian American fall apart as soon as we cross the border of the United States? And so she says it doesn't travel well in the sense that, well, if it's a category that's sort of delineated by the national borders of the US, what happens when you leave the US? Does that category kind of simply cease to have any real significance or meaning? Now, what's interesting about this essay is that it actually turned out to be kind of a minority position within Asian American studies. In other words, Wang's position was seen as somewhat retrograde, somewhat sort of conservative, because the field was indeed moving very strongly towards a more international and transnational set of perspectives. And so Wang was trying to sound a kind of warning about this move and to say, hang on, are we going to lose anything really significant, anything really important about Asian American studies if we kind of bring it to a new sort of international, transnational way of thinking? So the reason I wanted to bring this kind of category up is that I think it is an interesting way of thinking about, can the category of Asian American be taken out of the United States? And if so, how? What would that mean? So that's kind of the starting point for my thinking about the category of Asian diaspora, because part of what I'm going to argue today is that the category of Asian diaspora is actually a way of doing exactly what Wang thought maybe wasn't possible, which was to take some of the characteristics of the category Asian American and bring them outside the boundaries of the United States. So what that looks like and what the implications of that are is what I'll try to explore today. So here are some kind of initial questions that I want to bring up about the category Asian diaspora. So does the category Asian diaspora, just to be clear, I've not really defined what I even mean by Asian diaspora yet. I'm kind of anticipating a little bit here, but just to kind of give us a sense of some of the key things I'm going to be looking at in the next few minutes. Does the concept of Asian diaspora represent a continuity with the concept of Asian American or a break with it? What does the term Asian and Asian diaspora mean? And how does it relate to other academic and disciplinary uses of the term Asian? What happens to the concept of pan-ethnicity under diaspora? Now, pan-ethnicity, I'll kind of expand on a little bit more, but it's always been a kind of central concept of Asian American. And I guess I'll kind of define it really briefly here as the concept Asian American is a pan-ethnic category in the sense that it includes people from a number of different ethnic groups. So Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, Indian Americans, and so on, who previously would have been thought of as occupying very different kinds of identity categories, are brought together under the concept Asian American. So the pan-ethnicity of the concept Asian American is really central to how the concept works. So what happens if we move to a more diasporic framework? Does that pan-ethnicity hold or does it fall apart? And then finally, does the diasporic turn extend the radical critique embedded within Asian American studies, or does it diffuse it? Asian American studies from its origin has thought of itself as a highly political discipline, one that responds to certain imperatives around imperialism, around racism, around kind of a critique of the United States as a nation. what happens when we move into a diasporic framework? Are these modes of critique sort of retained, or do they erode in some way? And hopefully, kind of what I'm getting at with some of these questions will become more clear as we go on. Okay, so the term Asian diaspora is really a relatively recent one in academic scholarship. It's really only been around for about 25 years. I mean, maybe in academic world that is a very long time. By some perspectives, that's quite a long time. By others, it's quite new. This anthology, this collection, Orientations, Mapping Studies in the Asian Diaspora, published in 2001, is one of the first anthologies to really use this concept. Now, what's interesting about Orientations and some of the work that followed it was that what's meant by the Asian diaspora is very interesting and complex in it. So a lot of the individual chapters in a book like this are about sort of the very traditional notion of diaspora. So diaspora historically has referred to quite simply a group that is kind of scattered from its original origins. So if we talk about the Jewish diaspora or the Chinese diaspora, the idea being a people that has in some way been kind of displaced from its quote unquote homeland, whether that's through voluntary migration, whether that's through exile, whether that's through the kind of destruction of the original homeland. These are all forces that can kind of create a diaspora. But again, in the traditional concept of diaspora, there's a very heavy emphasis on origins. So the idea that a group might kind of want to reclaim its homeland or return to the homeland, that it's always kind of looking towards the homeland in some way, and that the homeland itself sort of provides a principle of coherence for the diaspora. The Chinese diaspora, in this very traditional way of looking at it, maintains its sort of integrity because there's some kind of central origin that it shares. Now, that concept of diaspora has increasingly been challenged in recent years, but that's something I'll kind of get to in a moment. This collection mostly has fairly traditional kind of deployments of diaspora. So there's might be a chapter on kind of Chinese migrants in the Philippines or Filipino migrants in the United States. So it mostly focuses on kind of individual ethnic or national groups and then sort of brings them all together under the umbrella category of these are all Asian diasporas. So the question might arise, what holds these different groups together? What do Chinese migrants in the Philippines and Korean immigrants in South Korea, Korean immigrants in South America and Filipino migrants in the United States, what do these groups have to do with each other, if anything? This is a question that's raised by the scholar David Palumbo Liu in his contribution to a later anthology. This is Asian Diasporas, New Formations, New Connections, which was published a few years later. Palumbo Liu asked the following: why Asian diasporas? Why retain Asia? What holds these discrepant phenomena together? Are Asian diasporas accidents, coincidences of location or geography? Or is it not a racial term and thus a way of relying on some family resemblance among the subjects under scrutiny and relegating others outside? Okay, so what I think Palumbo Liu is getting at here is that when Asian diaspora sort of leaves the boundaries of a single country, and we're talking about, say, Chinese diasporas, Indian diasporas, Korean diasporas, what holds those groups together as a category? And Palumbo Liu asks quite bluntly, isn't this just a racial category? Isn't it just the category of Asian, as that category has been developed in the United States as a racial category? Because obviously, in other contexts, we wouldn't necessarily talk about these different diasporas in the same framework, in the same breath. So Palumbo Liu is suggesting, I think, that at some level, there's a kind of residual trace of Asian American in Asian diasporas, because only if the Asian in Asian diasporas is the Asian and Asian American, does it make sense to kind of bring all of these different groups together under this umbrella? And Palumbo Liu is suggesting those who are deploying the concept haven't really given a kind of thorough account of what holds an Asian diaspora together. Instead, it's kind of remained implicit in the concept, and kind of the ghost of Asian American identification as a racial category still kind of is hiding in the background in some way. So in order to understand better, I think, what Palumbo Liu is kind of getting at, I want to review a little bit how the category of Asian American studies has sort of developed over time. And I can see that the slide a little bit blocked there. So the top line says, from cultural nationalism to pluralism in Asian American studies. So there's a very common narrative in the field of Asian American studies that basically says something like the following. There was a sort of early stage of Asian American identity, one that's identified with the 1960s and 1970s, that was about so-called cultural nationalism. In this narrative, cultural nationalism is something whereby Asian American is kind of a single unitary way of being. You can sort of determine whether somebody is or is not kind of authentically Asian American based on their political orientation, based on their culture, based on who they are, where they came from, and so on. And it's about kind of asserting this Asian American identity against, say, white American identity or other kinds of American identity. So in the 1990s, a lot of scholars in Asian American studies begin to question what they see as this kind of very unitary, monolithic idea of Asian American identity. Elaine Kim, one of the sort of early scholars of Asian American literature, in her foreword to Reading the Literatures of Asian America in 1992, argues that what we need is a shift from a cultural nationalism that's based on a single idea of what it means to be Asian American to a cultural pluralism that says Asian American could be a lot of different things. Asian American encompasses a lot of different cultures, a lot of different ethnic groups, and we need to kind of account for that diversity. And Kim, like a lot of scholars from this era, argues that part of the reason for this necessity are things like kind of renewed waves of immigration from Asia to the United States. So the United States, as you may know, was sort of closed off formally to immigration from Asia through much of the first half of the 20th century. But in 1965, US immigration law changes and immigrants from Asia are being accepted in again, albeit under very different kinds of circumstances. So this renewed immigration is kind of changing the face of Asian America, according to Kim, and also kind of greater transnational mobility. So, increased airline travel, increased ease of going back and forth between North America and Asia. This is kind of changing the idea of what Asian America is. This idea of kind of a new idea of Asian American that's based on sort of pluralism rather than unity is probably best associated with Lisa Lowe's book, Immigrant Acts, published in 1996. Lowe famously emphasizes heterogeneity, hybridity, and multiplicity rather than an essentialist idea of Asian American identity. And Lowe, importantly, associates this with Asian American, placing Asian Americans in a more international context. In other words, suggesting that Asian American communities are still being shaped by international connections, by connections to sort of their ancestral countries and so on. Finally, Susan Koshy, in her essay, The Fiction of Asian American Literature, sharply critiques Asian American studies for relying on the concept of the nation in, quote, a transnational era where ethnicity is increasingly produced at multiple local and global sites rather than, as before, within the parameters of the nation state. So by the 1990s, there's beginning to be this kind of consensus within Asian American studies that Asian American studies shouldn't kind of limit its analysis to what happens within the borders of the US. the world has changed, it's becoming more transnational, and Asian American studies should change with it. A kind of very more recent development of this argument and a kind of culmination of it is Candace Chu's book, Imagine Otherwise, on Asian Americanist critique. I believe it's from 2003, but I'm kind of trying to remember what's behind that box. So Chu gives a kind of very neat summary of this narrative that I've just described. Okay, so she says in the 1960s, there was this cultural nationalist assertion of American identity. It was based in a pan-ethnic unity. So the idea that Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Indian Americans had enough in common with each other they could form a kind of political coalition as a strategy of anti-racist activism. So Asian American originally is based on an idea of different ethnic groups forming a kind of political unity. However, Chu says the time has now come to critique such paradigms for their heteronormative and masculinist biases, as well as their erasure of diversity. Now, for Chu, interestingly, this sort of critique of Asian American as a category is joined with a post-structuralist critique, so that she sort of argues for deconstructing Asian American as a category and establishing instead Asian American studies as a subjectless discourse that isn't grounded in any kind of empirical reality about Asian Americans. Now, this is maybe a little bit hard to wrap our heads around, but basically we end up with an Asian American studies that doesn't actually take Asian Americans as a kind of real extant category, because we have to sort of relentlessly deconstruct this category. And Chu goes so far as to argue that terms like race and Asian American are actually meaningless. Now, I've taken Chu a little bit out of context here, so this is a little bit tendentious, but I do think that Chu ultimately wants to kind of jettison terms like Asian American, because she questions whether they really have any kind of validity anymore when we acknowledge that it's such a kind of internally diverse category. So by the kind of early 2000s, we would seem to have reached a point where some scholars are arguing that because of transnationalism, because of the increasing diversity of the Asian American population, maybe Asian American doesn't even really mean anything anymore. Now, it may seem here, and I would maybe agree with this, that what Xiaoling Wang feared has come to pass, right? Which is that as we kind of move outside the boundaries of the United States, Asian American just kind of disintegrates. So we no longer really have any reason to use this concept because it's just sort of indefensible. So this is kind of where we end up, I would argue, when we begin to use terms like the Asian diaspora. And I think what I want to assert here is that Asian diaspora has turned out, I think, to be a way to acknowledge some of the things that Chu and other critics have argued about deconstructing Asian American, while still retaining some of the elements that are so politically crucial about Asian American as a category. Now, just as kind of a signifier of how, kind of widespread this change has become. So a number of very prominent Asian American studies programs in the United States have changed their titles in recent years to add diaspora or Asian diaspora to their titles. So University of California, Berkeley's program, one of the oldest in the country, has become from Asian American Studies is now Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies. Duke University is now the Asian American and Diaspora Studies program. So if the term diaspora has become kind of so prevalent that programs, like I can tell you as somebody who's been a director of a program, it's not that easy to change your program's name. You've got to get a lot of committees to approve it. It's got to go through a lot of bureaucracy. So if you change your program's name, you've got to think that it's pretty significant to do that. So the fact that these programs have done that suggests that diaspora has become a powerful enough concept that many Asian American studies programs and practitioners feel that we now have to incorporate it into our understanding of Asian American. Some more recent scholarship on the concept of Asian diasporas that I think helps illuminate this. This is a special issue of Women's Studies Quarterly, I believe from, see, I can read it here. It's 2019, on the concept of Asian diasporas. And the two editors of the issue argue that diaspora is a way of disrupting the cohesive nature of the nation, opposing essentialist and binary views of race and immigration, and highlighting the transnational, transhistorical connections between Asian communities around the world. But they still don't really give a very strong definition of what an Asian diaspora is. They refer to it as scattered communities, identities, imaginaries, connectivities, and relationships that are beyond US black-white racial logics. So all we really know about Asian diasporas is that it's kind of outside the US binary of black and white, but otherwise it's this very kind of expansive, scattered category that doesn't really give us much of a sense of coherence. Like, what does hold the concept of Asian diasporas together? Not really clear. I'm basically just going to make a sort of bold assertion here, which I've already sort of telegraphed a little bit. But I think the only way the concept of Asian diaspora makes any sense, the way that it's used by a lot of American academics, is if the Asian and Asian diaspora is essentially the same as the Asian and Asian American studies. In other words, the pan-ethnic category of Asian that was developed by Asian American activists in the United States, that is still, as Palumbo Liu put it, the racial category that holds together these different diasporic communities that arguably don't really have that much in common with each other at some level. Even in the 1960s, the idea that Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans had something in common with each other was very controversial, very provocative. These are communities that often had been at odds with each other, that often saw their interests as not coinciding. And activists during this period, especially younger activists, said, no, we want to assert that Asian communities in the United States should form a kind of political coalition. And I think it's that idea that still provides the intellectual coherence for the concept of Asian diaspora. But this is a bit of a problem because diaspora is a concept that sort of points more outward, that points against the idea of a kind of single unified community. So I think what I'm suggesting here is that Asian diaspora ends up being this very sort of contradictory category. On the one hand, it has this kind of racializing element that comes out of US history. On the other hand, it also has a kind of scattering or broadening element that pushes outside the boundaries of the nation. So I think in using the category of Asian diaspora, we always have to keep in mind that it has these kinds of contradictory elements. The scholar Christopher Lee has what I think is a useful kind of development of the term in his essay from 2015, Mobility and Metaphor, published in the journal Verge. Lee argues that Asian diaspora studies is, quote, a collection of intellectual projects that includes nationally based formations such as Asian American studies, Asian Australian studies, and Asian Canadian studies. So Lee is explicitly suggesting that, okay, Asian diaspora studies is actually a coalition of a kind. It's just that it's a coalition of different, quote unquote, Asian scholars from these different kinds of countries, the United States, Australia, and Canada in particular. Lee also distinguishes Asian diaspora studies from other fields that take Asia as their object. So in other words, Asian diaspora studies doesn't necessarily have the same approach as, say, quote unquote, Asian studies or area studies, noting, as he puts it, the separate trajectories and histories of these fields. The fields that constitute Asian diaspora studies, Lee argues, have historically sought to distance themselves from quote unquote Asia as an object of study, in large part to counteract stereotypes of Asians as perpetual foreigners. So in a strange way, actually, what holds Asian diaspora studies together is they're all studies of Asian people who are outside of Asia. So, and it's really only kind of coming out of Asia. It's like, when you leave, if you leave Japan, you kind of leave Japan as a Japanese person. But then when you enter the United States, you become Asian, is kind of the simplest way I can put it. And so that idea of sort of Asian populations who are sort of racialized and minoritized in majority white societies, that's what seems to hold sort of Asian diaspora studies together. So again, just to reiterate, I see Asian diaspora as a contradictory formation. So diaspora implies a scattering from some origin, the Chinese diaspora, the Filipino diaspora, the Jewish diaspora. But Asian reflects racialization within the destination country. So Asian diaspora focuses, I would suggest, should focus on connections among different groups that have been racialized as Asian in different national settings. And this is sort of what Lee implied in his argument, that Asian diaspora studies is not about, say, kind of looking at Chinese people in the US and talking about their connections to China, but looking at Asian populations in places like the United States, Canada, Australia, other places, and saying, what do these very different groups have in common with each other? Do they have connections with each other at all? So in my work on this concept, I've actually turned to another example of diaspora studies that I think is very productive, a somewhat older model, but Paul Gilroy's work in the Black Atlantic is something that I've found to be very useful in thinking about how I understand the concept of an Asian diaspora. Now, what's interesting is that Gilroy's often been talked about as somebody who is a sort of champion of pluralism, who's very against kind of essentialism. He has another well-known book that's called Against Race. And Gilroy has been known as a kind of antagonist of any kind of essentialism or anything that would say that kind of race has a sort of fixed reality. But what's interesting in reading the Black Atlantic is that I see in Gilroy's work another kind of strand, which is that Gilroy is critical of essentialism, but he's also very critical of pluralism. He says pluralism, which affirms Blackness as an open signifier, in other words, that Blackness can kind of mean anything, he argues has been insufficiently alive to the lingering power of specifically racialized forms of power and subordination. So pluralism also can kind of go too far in neglecting the sort of historical basis of racism. Gilroy argues the worth of the diaspora concept is in its attempt to specify differentiation and identity in a way which enables one to think about the issues of racial commonality outside of constructing binary frameworks, especially those that counterpose essentialism and pluralism. So this is a quite complex statement here, but what I take Gilroy to be saying is that diaspora isn't a kind of antagonist to essentialism or to a unitary identity. Rather, he sees diaspora as a dialectic between essentialism and pluralism. In diasporic identity, there will be this kind of constant shuttling between sort of very forceful assertions of identity and then forces that kind of break apart that identity or show its internal diversity. But for Gilroy, that is what diaspora is, this kind of movement between sort of asserting an identity and then kind of undermining it in some way. And interestingly, Gilroy himself does have a concept in his book that I think is somewhat analogous to what I'm trying to establish with the idea of Asian diasporas, which is that who is the subject of his book, the Black Atlantic? And so Gilroy makes this argument that the Atlantic slave trade is sort of the origin of the sort of historical phenomenon of Blackness that he wants to study. And he frequently uses the phrase in his book, Blacks in the West, This is a formation that is based on the structure of the African diaspora into the Western Hemisphere. So in other words, Gilroy doesn't want to establish a concept of sort of universal blackness that would apply anywhere in the world. He wants to develop a concept that is very particular to a historical formation that is formed by the slave trade and formed by the diaspora of Africans into the Western Hemisphere, especially into the Americas. So I see Gilroy as being a really powerful example of how diaspora can still be kind of a very rigorous dialectical mode of analyzing this kind of migration that still, as he says, remains alive to racialized forms of power and subordination. So what are some implications of what I've been sort of arguing up to this point? I'm not suggesting that Asian diasporic populations should only be studied in a pan-ethnic context. Obviously, there will always be studies of kind of particular diasporic or ethnic groups that focus on what's particular to those ethnic groups. However, I would suggest that when we use the term Asian diaspora, we are always invoking the history and politics of pan-ethnic racialization. In other words, when we invoke Asian in this context, we are always invoking race and racialization in some way. Just to reiterate again, the Asian and Asian American studies and Asian diaspora studies is not the Asian and Asian studies. In the former, Asian is a racial category. In the latter, Asian is largely a kind of geographical category or a sort of area category. And then finally, insofar as Asian diaspora offers a bridge between Asian American studies and Asian studies, it brings with it a critique of racialism, nationalism, and imperialism that undergirds Asian American studies. In other words, I do want to suggest that Asian diaspora is a way of kind of bringing those historical and political concerns that ground Asian American studies into an international context. Okay, so what does this look like in practice? I think this is all very kind of interesting as a kind of set of conceptual debates and as a set of frameworks. But what actually is an Asian diaspora and what does it look like? I've tried to explore this question in my work by looking at poetry, which may seem somewhat contradictory. Poetry is, a kind of relatively sort of, it's a high literary art. It's one that, perhaps doesn't have as big a reach as, say, the mass media or other forms of communication. But I have been really interested in thinking about how poetry and poetics can help us think about the concept of an Asian diaspora. In part because poetry is always interested in form. And if we want to understand what the forms of Asian diasporic connection are, how different things are sort of connected to each other, then looking at literary form might be a way of understanding how some Asian diasporic subjects are kind of navigating that understanding of connection. And one question I want to ask is, how does an Asian diasporic poetics look different, if at all, from an Asian American poetics? So in other words, is there a difference between an Asian American poetics that kind of stops the boundaries of the United States and an Asian diasporic poetics that goes beyond them? Now, one thing that's really interesting to me about asking this question is that it's actually a question that's been asked a lot before. And in fact, I think it's a question that actually brings us back to the very origins of the idea of Asian American and Asian American literature as a category. This is a photograph of Janice Mirikitani, who passed away just a few years ago, and who was, during the 1970s, probably one of the most prominent Asian American writers. So she's Japanese American, experienced the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II by the US government. During the 1960s, she became involved in activist politics And during the 1970s, she became one of the first kind of Asian American poets to really rise to prominence. Now, I could spend much more time talking about Mirikitani, a fascinating figure. I do encourage you to sort of seek out her work, but I'm just going to give you 3 lines from one of Mirikitani's poems, We the Dangerous, that was published in 1978. And the 3 lines are simply this: Hiroshima, Vietnam, Tule Lake. Okay, I can't resist being a little sort of teacherly at this moment and saying, okay, how many people know? Okay, so how many people know what Tule Lake is? Okay, I would guess that, well, that's okay because most of my students wouldn't know what Tule Lake is either. Okay, so Tule Lake is one of the sites of the incarceration camps where Japanese Americans were imprisoned during World War II. Okay, so now that you know that, I'm going to assume, well, let me see if I need to explain the other 2 or not. I'm guessing I don't, but let's see. What do you make of the fact that these 3 terms are just juxtaposed to each other? They're just put next to each other. What does this mean? Like, why would you put these 3 places next to each other in a poem? How do you read or interpret that? Does anyone have any thoughts? Okay, why do you think Hiroshima is here? Why do you think it's mentioned in this poem? Yes, obviously the dropping of the atomic bomb by the United States during World War II on Hiroshima. Okay, so I would assume that's the reference here. What about Vietnam? Now remember, this is a US poem written in the 1970s. So why do you think Vietnam is being mentioned? Yes, the US war in Vietnam. Right. Okay. So we have the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. We have the US war in Vietnam, which probably at the writing of this poem has either sort of just ended or if it was written earlier is still ongoing. And Tule Lake, the place where Japanese Americans were incarcerated by the US government during World War II. What do these 3 places have in common? What links them? I'm sorry, say that again. Violence committed against Asians, right? I mean, I think that seems very straightforwardly like that's what is happening. In all 3 cases, there has been some kind of violence committed by the United States against, but see, this is exactly the moment where we then have to ask ourselves, and who are Asians, right? Because these are 3 different national populations. We have Japan, we have Vietnam, and then we have Japanese Americans, the bulk of whom, almost all of whom were American citizens, right? So for those of you who don't know that much about the history of Japanese American incarceration, American citizens of Japanese descent were kind of forcibly relocated to these incarceration camps during World War II because their loyalty to the US government was suspect. So that's right. In a very kind of powerful, simple, sort of elegant way that doesn't really explain itself, I would argue that the juxtaposition of these 3 terms is creating an idea of Asian solidarity, right? And it's one that is intentionally critical of the kind of militarism of the United States. So it's kind of saying, okay, these groups that are kind of like have been the subjects of violence from the US, and that kind of brings them together, even though they may be kind of across different national boundaries. So I would say we have here, and again, this is in the 1970s. This is supposedly during the era of cultural nationalism and sort of like, just sticking within the borders of the United States. We have an image of Asian solidarity that goes well beyond the boundaries of the US. Only one of these three populations is within the United States. And that population, in the person of a Japanese American author, is asserting solidarity with Asian populations across national borders. So I would argue that what we're seeing here is kind of a very early idea of what that Asian diasporic sort of solidarity might look like. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to thinking about kind of my three, and I don't know that I will get to all three since it looks like we've already been talking for a bit. So I will talk a bit about Teresa Hawk Young Cha, because I know a lot of you are readers of Cha and interested in her work, and to think about how Cha's work might be a kind of exemplar of this Asian diasporic sensibility. So a little bit about Cha for those of you who aren't familiar with her work. She was born in Korea in 1951, and she immigrates to the US with her family in 1963. So she first comes to Hawaii and then to the San Francisco Bay Area. She attends high school in the Bay Area, where she studies French and classics, later attends UC Berkeley, and then begins a career as a visual, video, and performance artist in the later 1970s. In the early 1980s, she moves to New York City, and her first book, Dictée, is published in 1982. And sadly, as those of you who are familiar with Cha's life know, she was murdered that same year in 1982 at the age of 30. So Cha's work has frequently been, is now today considered to be a kind of major part of the Asian American literary canon, but it wasn't always so. So Dictée, published in 1982 by a small New York publisher, it was largely neglected until the early 1990s, when it's sort of rediscovered by Asian American literary scholars. It was republished in the mid-1990s along with an essay collection about Cha's work, and then it was republished in 2001 by an academic press, the University of California Press. What's interesting about these first Asian American readings of Cha's work, which are collected in this essay collection, Writing Self, Writing Nation, is that a number of the critics talk about how they really didn't like or didn't understand Cha's work when they initially read it. So Elaine Kim, who I've already talked about, says, the first time I glanced at Dictée, I was put off by the book. I thought that Teresa Cha was talking not to me, but rather to someone so remote from myself that I could not recognize him. The critic Laura Kang writes, I found myself literally yelling at the book. It angered me that the text was not always accessible, that it seemed to speak to a highly literate, theoretically sophisticated audience that I did not identify with. Most of all, Cha herself remained elusive. So I think we can see here that what Kim and Kang are looking for is a point of identification within the work. How is Teresa Cha, a Korean American woman like me? These are both Korean American critics, and they don't find it, and that frustrates them. But what came to be argued by many critics was that that was kind of exactly the point of Dictée. Dictée did not give you these obvious points of identification where you could kind of see Cha's biography or understand how you, as an Asian American, would kind of identify with her story. And because of this, Dictée became a sort of key text in this sort of turn towards diaspora. So Lisa Lowe's essay, Unfaithful to the Original, which is kind of one of the most influential essays on Cha, argues that Cha continually thwarts the reader's desire to abstract a notion of ethnic or national identity. She argues that there's an emphasis on the politics of difference over those of identity, and hence on the diasporic over the national. So she doesn't give us a kind of Asian American identification. Instead, she gives us kind of multiple points of identification rather than settling on any one. Now, some critics wondered if readings like Lowe's placed too much emphasis on difference. The critic Shelley Sun Wong worried that there was a risk of erasing the kind of particularity of Cha as a Korean American writer in favor of, quote, colonizing difference itself and rendering alterity for alterity's sake. What I want to suggest here again is that Asian diaspora can be kind of useful as a category if we think of it as a dialectical framework that attempts to keep both identity and difference in view. In other words, to talk about both those moments where Cha does kind of provide a concrete site of identification or kind of biographical realities, but also sort of reads those alongside those locations where she undermines that kind of identification or sort of refuses to allow us to identify. I just wanted to put this slide up because I find it so interesting. This is a series of images of the different covers that Dictée has had over the years. So this is the original cover, and you can see that there's just this kind of strange, mysterious landscape where there are just these rocks. There's no kind of image of a person. We have no idea where this place is. When the University of California Press republished it in these two editions, it put pictures of people on the cover. So this is an image from the inside of the book that is actually Cha's mother. This is an image of Cha herself. But interestingly, in the newest restored edition, the University of California Press has put the original cover back. So they've restored the cover from their own changes to it. What I find interesting about this is that it's clear that in these issues, the University of California Press is trying to give us a point of identification, right? It's trying to give us a person who we can identify as being kind of the biographical subject of the work. But it's pretty clear that that's not what Cha wanted us to do. Cha wanted to kind of deflect our efforts to identify a person as the subject and instead sort of give us this forbidding, mysterious landscape that we have to interpret. And I think that's very kind of indicative of our struggles with Dictée and our desire to kind of find a point of identification in the way Cha kind of doesn't want to give us one. Okay, I'm just going to try to say a couple of brief things about Dictée, because obviously I could also spend the entire lecture talking about Dictée. The section Calliope Epic Poetry is one of the most frequently talked about sections, and it's a section that is footnoted that's based on the journals of Cha's mother. The family is described as having moved to Manchuria to escape the Japanese occupation, and that's described as there being refugees, immigrants, exiles, far away from the land that is not your own. One thing that I think is interesting from a diasporic perspective in this section is that this section offers kind of varying definitions of home, but none of these definitions are actually directly geographical. So, for example, she says that your spirit has not left. She talks about the language, mother tongue is your refuge. She talks about a particular sort of nationalist song as being a sort of site of identity, but none of these are kind of geographical places. So it is, I think, very much a diasporic consciousness in the sense that Korea as a place kind of can't be reclaimed, but that Koreanness can kind of be sort of located in these other phenomena that are not about a geographical location. Another thing that's interesting about the book is that critics tend to focus on these sections that do kind of talk about Cha's biography or that do focus on sort of Korea as a location. But a lot of the book actually doesn't do this at all. So later sections of the book, they'll kind of draw materials from, like there's one that's drawn from the biography of a saint. There's a lot of kind of focus on film as a kind of medium and sort of as a kind of partition that sort of divides us from being able to see the world. And then finally, Cha, I would argue, kind of makes a reference to her own performances. One of the last sections references a myth of a Korean princess who undertakes a journey to the underworld to find medicine for her father. And the description of this princess seems to be kind of a self-referential description to Cha's own performances. She would often kind of wear these white robes and kind of a white headband, and that's kind of how she describes this figure in her book. So there's also a kind of lot of self-referentiality that I think refers to Cha's own sort of artistic practice. So as I said, I think there's a lot to be said about how Dictée can be seen as kind of an expression of diasporic poetics, and perhaps we can kind of talk about that more in the discussion period, especially for those of you who may be familiar with Cha. Okay, taking a look at the time, I want to probably move a little bit towards concluding. So I will be happy to talk about my other two examples a little more in the Q&A if people would like to hear about them. I'll just kind of quickly preview them. So one figure I look at in my book is the poet Ouyang Yu, who is a poet who came to Australia from China in the early 1990s and who has subsequently become a very well-known figure on the Australian literary scene. And the other writer that I looked at quite significantly was the Canadian writer Fred Waugh, who is probably one of the better known Canadian writers of Asian descent. And one thing I really tried to look at is the way in which the work of writers like Ouyang and like Waugh kind of resonate with Asian American writing in various ways, but also kind of diverge from them in pretty significant ways. And yet all three, I would argue, seem to have a sense of using poetics to kind of explore what it means to be a sort of Asian racialized minority in a white dominant society, and that each of them use kind of very differing and very significant sort of aesthetic strategies to do this. I know that's a very kind of telegraphic way of describing it. And as I said, I'll be happy to kind of talk more about that if people would like to know more about these two figures. I want to close with what's probably going to be more a set of questions than a set of assertions, which is what happens when you bring Asian diasporic poetics to Asia? Now, I'm going to kind of call out Professor Wee a little bit here because he asked me a few days ago kind of how I was experiencing being in Singapore. And in particular, I think the question was about, obviously in the US, I'm a racial minority, right? Asians still make up kind of less than 10% of the US population. So Asian Americans often have that experience of being kind of marginalized, feeling like they're the only kind of Asian face in a largely white room and so on. So the question was, how did it kind of feel for me as a kind of quote unquote member of the Asian diaspora to come to a place like Singapore, where arguably I'm quote unquote ethnically in the majority? And I really have been thinking about that a lot over the past few days, and I'm not really sure how to answer this question. I think on the one hand, I'm kind of very aware that visibly I kind of, multiple people when I've interacted with them in kind of shops or things like that, they'll, start speaking to me in Chinese, or they'll ask me if I'm Singaporean, right? And so it's actually possible for me to at first glance pass as a Singaporean, which is very interesting to me. But it's also kind of alienating because I realize that I'm not, and that I kind of don't fit in. And so it's interesting to think about kind of what that consciousness means in a place where kind of quote unquote my ethnic group is in the majority. So that's kind of a question that I have, and whether or not these kinds of frameworks sort of resonate when we take them outside of the sites that I'm looking at, which are basically kind of white settler colonies that have kind of Asian immigrant populations, and bring them to a place like Singapore, where obviously diaspora is also part of the kind of story of Singapore, but I think in a very different way, perhaps, than they are in places like the United States or Australia. I wanted to, this is an image from the Singapore Literature Festival that was held in New York City a couple years ago. And the poet Ji Leung Ko actually invited me to be part of this panel. And I said to him, I'm like, I'm not really sure I kind of belong here. Like, are you sure you want me to be part of this panel? He's like, no, we really want you to talk about diaspora. And so it made me think a lot about how this concept of diaspora sort of fits into a Singapore framework. And I'm just going to close with a few kind of comments from Ko on in an interview that he did a few years ago. And I'm just going to read these, and because I really, as a non-Singaporean, kind of don't exactly know how to reflect on some of these comments. And so I'd be interested to hear from some of you kind of how you think these comments kind of reflect on your understanding of diaspora and whether they kind of intersect with the concept of diaspora I've been trying to explore here. So he says the following. I feel more Chinese in New York City than in Singapore, mainly because in New York, I am in the ethnic minority. I feel less Chinese in China than in Singapore because as a Southeast Asian, I am very different from the Chinese. Then from the viewpoint of China, writings by Chinese Singaporeans are diasporic writings and therefore secondary. From the viewpoint of Singapore, we are nobody's peripheral, but our own center. And then finally, I think looping back to the question of like, why poetry, he says, it is in poetry that I feel most at home. When I am writing, I feel I am most myself, making myself up as I go along. Okay, so we're at about the hour mark of talking. So I think that would probably be a good time for me to sort of wrap up my remarks and sort of open the floor to discussion. So I'm very eager to hear your thoughts about kind of how you sort of receive this concept of Asian diaspora and whether it kind of makes sense or resonates to you. Kind of what you think about it as a framework for looking at some of these writers that I've described. And then finally, kind of how, if at all, you think it sort of resonates differently in the Singaporean context. So I will stop there and very happy to take your questions and comments. And thank you very much. So are we? Oh, yes. Okay. So we've got, for those of you who are listening, I guess, online, you can also submit questions and we will do our best to take them, but also happy to have questions from those of you who are here in the room, if there are any at this point. So, yes. Yes, sure. Uh,
I'm intrigued by the expansiveness of Asian diaspora, which obviously has great potential and also I'm always wondering with this expanding a US-centric and ethnic tradition in the Mexico brain. And I also thinking about Chinese law question. So my question and relations with Asian diaspora as a concept, what is Chinese tradition and what is the movement? When does strategic essentialism stop strategic and start running the risk of being self-defeating? And how does a global analysis alter the states?
Okay, that's a very complex question. I think I may need to unpack it a little bit. There's also some references that people may not totally follow. Okay, so I would agree that yes, I think I've argued here that Asian diaspora is a way of projecting a kind of concept of Asianness that arguably originates in the United States into a global framework. I think that's simply a fact of where this kind of scholarship is coming. That Asian diaspora largely is being used by scholars in the US, to some degree in Canada, perhaps to some degree in Australia, and that it is a concept that emerges from the distinct histories of racialization of Asians in those countries. Now, essentially, I think what scholars are trying to do is to take that concept and see if it can kind of function beyond the boundaries of the United States. But yes, I completely agree that there is a risk of kind of imposing a very US-centric idea of Asianness on other places. So I do think that's why it's important to say that, you know, Asian studies or other kinds of area studies, that isn't the same kind of Asian. And taking concept about the Asian diaspora and sort of applying them to quote unquote Asians in Asia isn't necessarily going to work very well either. I do think that what's important about it is that it's a way of trying to create a kind of dialogue between the Asian American and the Asian, I think, that doesn't require one to sort of subsume the other. I think Asian American studies historically has been very worried that Asian studies is going to kind of gobble it up or is going to sort of displace it in some way. Because Asian Americanists tend to believe that Asian studies, area studies, is a kind of very sort of Eurocentric way of looking at Asia as a region. In contrast, Asian studies, I think, has tended to see Asian American studies sometimes as fairly narrow, as kind of very focused on a certain mode of racial politics, and kind of not really capable of speaking to a more global framework. So I mentioned this journal Verge, and there's this project of sort of global Asias that Professor Tina Chen at Penn State University in the US has been kind of spearheading. And those are, I think, ways of trying to create this kind of dialogue between the Asian American and the Asian that does sort of keep racialization, colonialism, politics kind of in view, while understanding that the US isn't kind of the only location in which those kinds of analyses can take place. Okay. Another part of the question has to do with my own poetry, so I probably have to explain that part. So those of you who were at the reading earlier this week know that I'm also the author of a poetry book, and this poetry book is called 100 Chinese Silences. So the question, I believe, was kind of like, well, how do I square sort of what I'm doing with Asianness here with my use of Chinese as a sort of category in my poetry? And usefully, there's a quotation from Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior, where for those of you who haven't read The Woman Warrior, Kingston is addressing like her fellow Chinese Americans. And she says, Chinese Americans, like, how do you know like what's just your family and what's actually like Chinese culture? And then she says, what is Chinese culture and what is the movies? How do we know like what's kind of really Chinese? And this is a very common thing that Chinese Americans will kind of ask about, because of course, being in diaspora, you know, your idea of kind of what Chineseness is heavily filtered through your own family, your own kind of local community, and you feel kind of cut off from whatever you think the sources of Chineseness are. I guess in thinking about my own poetry, I really didn't have that much interest in thinking about kind of Chineseness as an identity category. Rather, it was more like I was interested in the way Chineseness had been kind of constructed in US culture through a certain set of stereotypes, through a certain set of discriminatory laws, and also through literatures, through a certain kind of poetics whereby Chineseness was defined by certain sort of poetic qualities. So I think I wanted to point to Chineseness there as kind of a construct, right? Rather than saying, I'm Chinese. Like, I don't, you know, this is going to sound a little strange. I feel like when people ask me, do you think of yourself as Chinese? I will often be like, oh, you know, it's a little bit of a strange question for me. And I actually think I do, and I'm part of a generation that does sort of identify more strongly with the term Asian American or Asian than with Chineseness, right? But again, I understand that that's very particular to the way in which race works in the US. It's not going to make a lot of sense if I take it out of that context and say, put it here. So I can hear where that kind of is going to land really differently for an audience in Singapore than it would for an audience in the US. And I was very kind of aware of that when I was reading the poems. So I hope that answers Annabeth's question. I mean, I think there was a lot of it, but yeah. Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question because, of course, Asian in the US context, I mean, it's very hard to pin down looking Asian to any particular sort of appearance or set of features because there's such a broad range of ethnicities that are included in the term Asian in the US. Now, I think if you ask the average American kind of what their stereotype of an Asian person is, they're going to think an East Asian, probably someone who like appears to be nominally Chinese or something like that, just because that historically was the largest Asian ethnic group. But I think the essentialist versus constructivist debate, like to me, I think that Asian American as an identity from the earliest days was understood to be a kind of political identity. It was understood to be a kind of political coalition. So it wasn't about how do you feel or what do you look like. It was about political solidarity with other groups of people. And defining that group was what defined Asianness or Asian American. So, for example, to go back to Janice Mirikitani's poem, what made Japanese Americans Asian was their identification with, say, people in Vietnam who they understood to be fighting against American imperialism, right? So that doesn't have anything to do with how you look, how you feel. It has to do with kind of how you understand your kind of political position to interact with someone else's. Now, that's the kind of origin of the category. I would say that you're right in that that's not how the category kind of functions anymore because people do now talk about like, oh, you look Asian or like, I feel Asian because XYZ, or I'm Asian because like I engage in these cultural practices or something. So it has become a much kind of broader cultural category. Whereby people can sort of simply say, oh, like you don't look Asian, you look Asian, and so on. So I think that it does sort of have that function as a racializing category. I wouldn't say that I don't think that necessarily has to do with these kind of theoretical debates about essentialism versus constructivism, because I would say that Asian American historically has tried to not engage that issue by being a political category. But I do think that for a lot of people, Asian has, that debate between essentialism and sort of pluralism sort of continues. And I think it continues to be a lot of the popular discourse about Asian Americans, whether or not it's part of the scholarly discourse. So hopefully that someone answers your question. Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay.
South Asians, West Asians.
Yes. I mean, the answer is both yes, they absolutely are, and yes, that is a fair critique of this presentation. I mean, I think that, and it's something that a number of people have said about diasporic poetics, is that, okay, it's, yes, you know, you say it's this kind of internally diverse category, but it's all, you know, like East Asians, and in fact, it's primarily people of Chinese descent. So I do think that is a problematic within, you know, that is kind of deeply rooted in the history of Asian American studies that has historically kind of been centered around East Asians. So I think that they are absolutely part of the narrative. They absolutely should be part of the narrative. But even in the United States, I think there's a lot of debate about the extent to which South Asians and certainly West Asians feel as if they are included in the category Asian American. So, you know, often we will see that South Asian Americans, for example, will say, does Asian American apply to us? Are we included? When there's an Asian American Student Center, are we invited to that? And so there will be even, you know, kind of Asian American student centers will also often be named in a way that kind of specifies, oh, yes, like, you know, South Asian students are invited into this category. I mean, I think the kind of emerging in the US sort of category of West Asians and West Asian Americans is something that's kind of very powerful right now. I think as you know, Asian Americans are kind of grappling with their own sort of positionality on Israel-Palestine, and for many Asian Americans, kind of asserting solidarity with Palestine is something that for them is very much part of Asian American solidarity. For others, it is not. And so I think that this question of sort of to whom does solidarity extend still continues to be a very live issue. Um, okay. There's one there. Oh, yeah, please. Yeah. Yeah, this was specifically with relation to G, right? To G Lunko. Yes. Um, so it's really interesting because my interactions with him have entirely been in Asian American literary spaces, right? So, you know, I met him in part through my involvement in Asian American literary organizations. I think I probably kind of, when I first met him, I just thought of him as like an Asian American writer, right? But I think it's very clear that his own understanding of his own positionality is much more fluid, right? That he says, well, you know, at times I feel very at home in New York City. This is the city where I live. This is the city I kind of identify with. And at other times, he does think of himself as, you know, somebody who is in diaspora, who has a certain kind of relationship to Singapore, but that is quite complex. So I think part of the worth of the diaspora concept is that it suggests that there doesn't have to be kind of a moment or a line where it's like, okay, you have crossed the boundary and now you're Asian American and there's no coming back. I think that kind of used to be the case because the facts of migration for many Asian Americans were very much one way. You know, like you could not return, or you simply did not have the financial resources to return, or you couldn't legally return. You know, that's less the case today for a lot of people. And so it means that you can both be Asian American or be within the US and still maintain these kinds of diasporic connections. So I think his work is really interesting, and his sense of himself is really interesting in that he both participates in sort of Asian American literary spaces, but also, you know, participates in what he understands to be Singaporean literary spaces, the way he understands them. And both are kind of part of his sense of his own work. I mean, you know, when we were at the bookstore the other day, you know, his book sitting there on the shelf with other sort of Singapore writers, and so, you know, but it's interesting that he may look quite different to a Singaporean audience versus an American audience. I mean, maybe an American audience thinks he's a writer from Singapore, and maybe Singaporean audiences think he's an American. So yeah, I think those contradictions, I think, are part of the kind of diasporic relationship. Thank you. Do you want to take another one from online, or because I think there was. Let's see. Okay, what do you feel are some trends or patterns across Asian diasporic poetics or literature, and how are they different from other literatures? Okay, well, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to go kind of into too much detail about some of my other examples. But I think Fred Waugh, the Canadian writer, is a really fascinating example to me in this regard, because Waugh has this really complex aesthetic. So within Canadian letters, he's primarily thought about as somebody whose techniques kind of come from the American avant-garde. So he was very influenced by the Black Mountain writers, especially by like Charles Olson and Robert Creeley. He was kind of this sort of young, like rebellious avant-gardist in the 1970s who was kind of bringing this stuff into like a kind of very staid world of Canadian poetry. But then during the 1980s, he begins to write work that's kind of more autobiographical. And he talks in particular about the story of his father, who as a child was born in Canada, but as a child was kind of sent back to China with his family, raised there for a lot of his childhood, and then came back to Canada. And so his father's sense of kind of displacement and sort of, you know, kind of being Canadian, but also sort of not really, you know, he kind of like had to relearn to speak English, and he had been raised in China and so on, his sense of kind of displacement. The reason I want to bring Waugh up here is that Waugh is a very interesting example of someone who very consciously kind of uses poetic forms to explore these kinds of connections. So, Waugh writes this poetry series during the 1980s about his first travel to China. So, you know, I think his ancestry is he's like a quarter Chinese, and then he has other kind of European ancestry and so on. But his name is Waugh, and actually he writes a number of poems about like, I don't look Chinese, but my name is Waugh. And so, you know, this kind of sense of like, I am Chinese, I'm not Chinese, like what does being Chinese mean? And so he goes to China, he travels there, but he writes about his experience in China using Japanese poetic form. So he writes it as like the haibun, right? You know, this kind of diaristic Japanese form. And so it's like, okay, this is a really interesting decision, right? Here's a writer of Chinese descent, and he uses a quote unquote Asian form, but it's a Japanese form. It's not a Chinese form. Why did he do that? What an interesting decision. Now, Waugh actually says that part of the reason he did this was that he was thinking consciously about kind of solidarity between Chinese and Japanese Canadians at the time. Because at the time in the 1980s, Japanese Canadians were kind of fighting for redress from the Canadian government of their own incarceration during World War II, which happened in a similar way to what happened in the US. So Hua formally kind of uses this Japanese technique to write about his travels to China. And, this might be a little bit reaching, but I feel that there's a kind of gesture towards a pan-ethnic politics and aesthetic. Now, he's certainly not the only poet to use Japanese forms, but I think there's kind of particular resonance to his use of those forms in the context of this history that he's evoking. So I think the question of how it looks kind of distinctive, it's not that I would say like, oh, Asian diasporic poets all write in the same way, by no means. But I do think that when you look at their kind of use of formal techniques to respond to their particular sort of historical conditions, that I think you do see certain kind of navigations of form that I think well, I don't know if they add up to kind of a distinct poetics. They can be sort of understood in a historical context that I think makes them sort of resonate with each other. So that's kind of, I think, the best I can I can sort of address that question. Were there other? I think I saw a couple of other hands in the room. Was there a question back there? Yeah. Mhm.
Definitional transition from Oriental to Asian American in the 1960s.
Mhm.
That also brought about J. Caspian Bogus American and his critique of whether or not Asian American identity is reified in
Yeah.
the 1960s revolutionary framework.
Yeah.
But in reality, ultimately incoherence. First generation Chinese doesn't really do much of it. You might not identify.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also of the maybe sometimes feeling of incoherence between different generations of Asian Americans, or as you pointed out in the questions, this broad coalition from these two clans.
Mhm.
For example, we can say that Asian Americans include the race of Chicago. So how they are.
Yes.
So much to read.
Yes. Right.
And if you think about that expansiveness, then that goes to this idea of Harold and Kamala Harris being the first Asian American candidate, on a party ticket for the presidency.
Yep.
You don't necessarily look at her and think of her as Asian American.
Mhm.
And then I think of Ren's recent lecture series at Harvard, where he talked about this Israel-Palestinian question as one of the heart of Asian American studies,
Mhm.
because I would say he was Palestinian American.
Yep.
You mentioned that already. But that's also parallel as to how Asian American or Asian national identity can always be affected by foreign policy. We country and the relation with big countries in Asia, for Syrians that are both big countries, Americans.
Yep.
The COVID.
Yeah.
So trying to get to my actual is, and I would all, which is this idea that race in particular context is an expression of class.
Mhm.
It's a more Marxian idea.
Yep.
We talk about over it from certain kind of labor that reflects the racialization that they. So I just wanted to comment on this relationship between race, class, class.
So this is the whole comment that race is the modality through which classes lived, right? So yeah, I mean, I think thank you. That's a lot of really useful thoughts. Let me kind of backtrack a little bit into your question, because I think I would kind of connect. So for those of you who don't know, J. Caspian Kang is this Korean American essayist who wrote this book recently that kind of was on Asian American issues, but arguably kind of challenges to some degree whether the category Asian American is kind of useful anymore for the reasons that you sort of described. It's really interesting to me, actually, that he, in some ways, some of these other academic critics who was, like 20 years ago, were kind of questioning the viability of Asian American as a category, very much anticipate his claims. He's like, well, look, Asian American's so broad. It includes so many people Like, does it even mean anything anymore? I think where I think Kang sort of misses the boat is like he doesn't really, again, he's kind of attached to that narrative where at one time there was this kind of unity, right? And he attaches it to that kind of activist period of the 1960s. But now that unity is over, or it's not viable anymore, so the category doesn't mean anything. I would say rather that the kind of debate about solidarity within Asian American identity is still ongoing. It's still under debate. Kang is absolutely right. A first generation Korean American may be like, I have nothing in common with a Palestinian American. I have absolutely nothing in common with like a fifth generation Japanese American. And that could very well be, right? That person may not identify with the term Asian American. I think where Kang kind of has fallen, what the trap he's fallen into is sort of something I addressed earlier, which is that he, like most people, has kind of fallen into the idea that Asian American is just purely a kind of cultural identification, right? It's just like a demographic category of like being Asian or having a certain set of experiences. And I think in that sense, sure, you can say that these groups may not have that much in common, but that was never, I would argue, the kind of main basis of Asian American as an identity. So, I understand where he's coming from, but I also think he's kind of missing a lot of the analysis. And I think, you mentioned Vietnamese sort of statements that kind of Palestinian solidarity is kind of a primary foregrounded issue for Asian Americans. And right, and I think a lot of Asian American activists do feel that that is exactly it, like that kind of solidarity. There's no question that I think activists from the 1970s would have said like that is the most pressing issue for Asian Americans, but clearly not all Asian Americans feel that way. So I do think that kind of internal diversity of the category is very something that we always have to kind of keep in view. Okay, so to your question, the question of class, the question of how are race and class kind of imbricated. I mean, obviously, this is an incredibly complex question that I don't know that kind of my approach and my work is necessarily illuminating that issue as strongly, right? Because I do think so. Ouyang Yu, who I didn't get a chance to talk about, um, is, he's a Chinese writer who kind of comes to Australia and has spent a lot of his career kind of railing against the Australian literary establishment, talking about kind of his own exclusion and so on. But what's interesting is Ouyang's sort of perspective is that he came to Australia as a student in the early 1990s to do a PhD in basically Australian literature. And then he became embittered because he was not able to find a job teaching at an Australian university. And he's publicly said repeatedly that he believes that's because of racism, that like he would not, they didn't see him as someone who could teach Australian literature to white Australians. Now, what's interesting is that from a class perspective, that on the one hand, he's somebody who's kind of from a highly educated class who sort of has a PhD, and part of it is this kind of like professional anger that he's not being allowed to use his skills. But on the other hand, I do think that so he's worked for most of his career actually as a translator. So like, he works in the courts and like translates for, clients and so on. So, he's kind of occupying a sort of professional class, but one that I think is not sort of at the status that he feels that his kind of education entitles him to. So I do think there's a lot of kind of like that's just one example of a way in which a kind of sort of class anger sort of intersects with a sense of racism. But again, interestingly, it's not kind of a sort of working class oriented anger. It's more the anger of a sort of professional class that feels that it's kind of not being accepted in Australia. So that's just an example. I think it's obviously a much more complex question than that, but thank you. Okay, do we want to, Jasmine, do you want to go ahead? No, please go ahead. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think part of the reason I brought up the Mirikitani example is that I actually think that from the very beginning of Asian American identity, sites outside of the United States were very primary to Asian American identity. Opposing the Vietnam War was, one of the kind of primary activist sort of moments that sort of ignited Asian American activism. Now, again, you may say it's like, okay, well, that's outside the US. That doesn't really have anything to do with like Japanese Americans, right? But the point is that it is kind of born out of this larger kind of global critique of imperialism that ends up being very central to this kind of domestic idea of an Asian American identity. Now, again, as I've said several times during this comment period, is that how kind of Asian American identity is sort of like lived today? Not necessarily, not by everyone, probably not by most people who would demographically to be ascribed as Asian Americans. But clearly for many Asian American activists, writers, intellectuals, and so on, yes, it is absolutely the case that like what is happening outside the United States is absolutely central to Asian American identity and activism. So I think that is that is the case. I think the kind of flattening that we see, I think it's simply part of this kind of dialectic that Gilroy talks about, right? That is what happens when you establish a category like this, a category like Asianness. It will always be flattened. There will always be a kind of incentive to turn it into a kind of merely cultural identification or one that it's just a demographic category. And activists will always see it as their task to kind of repoliticize the category in some way. And so I think you just see that kind of back and forth throughout the history of the concept. I think right now I think is a major inflection point as to whether certain groups are going to be sort of extended solidarity by Asian Americans or not, right? And the answer to that question will absolutely change what being Asian American is for kind of the next decade, I think. But it's not clear what that answer is going to be yet. I think so. I mean, for example, for intellectuals like Viet Thanh Nguyen, the answer is absolutely clear, right? That Asian Americans have a moral obligation to stand with Palestinians. But is the first generation Chinese immigrant going to think that? Probably not, right? And so I think that is a kind of internal struggle within this category that I think is very much part of this process. Do we want to? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that Fred Waugh, again, is a great exemplar of this because as a mixed race writer, he's constantly talking about sort of hybridity. He kind of like engages with it in a very ironic way a lot of the time. He has this line in one of his poems where he says something like, when you're not pure, you just make it up. There's this kind of I mean, his approach to that is a kind of playfulness with identity that is very kind of conscious of identity, but kind of refuses to be sort of pinned down in any particular way. But yeah, absolutely. I think that for mixed race writers, there often is this sense of like, and Asian diaspora, I think when it's taken to a very essentialist place, can be like, oh, well, you're mixed race, you're not diasporic, like, you didn't come from any one place, therefore kind of you're not really included. We don't want to see you as part of this category. I do think that can be a risk of thinking about diaspora in a kind of very traditionalist way, that it's going to exclude somebody who, is mixed race, or who like is maybe 2 or 3 generations removed from diaspora. That is something that I think is very much there. I do think that, this issue kind of plays out differently in different contexts. I mean, the UK is a very interesting kind of contrast this in some way. I mean, part of the reason I don't use the UK in a lot of my analysis is that I just think the dynamics are so different. Not only because the term Asian like isn't used in the same way in the UK as it is in the US, Canada, and Australia primarily. So I think that's a very complex question to answer, but I do think that what I see in the US at least is that for mixed race writers, the question of sort of how to identify with Asianness or Asian Americanness as a category is a kind of struggle or choice that they're often making. And I see many mixed race writers who do kind of embrace Asian American identity, and others who may kind of really sort of disidentify with it. And I do think there's that, and I think for those who do, there's often kind of a sense of like, do I really belong? Am I really accepted? That I think is absolutely a dynamic. Should I try to kind of quickly respond to some of the online? Yeah, I'll do kind of like a quick, like a, sort of quick hits on the online ones. Okay, so there's one question about Mirakatani asking, instead of saying if it refers to violence against Asians, can we say it's about villainization of Asians from the white perspective? I mean, obviously I took it out of context, so I can see where it sort of might read as like, this is a way in which they kind of look at, like looking at places where, oh, like, this is violence that should have been justified against Asians in some way. Part of the context is that the poem is called We the Dangerous, and those lines are followed, and like, and we were not humbled, and we were not sort of defeated. So Mirakatani's kind of asserting a sort of resistance to this by saying, but I mean, yes, sure, I think reading them as kind of sites of violence against Asians could also be seen as these are places where Asians were villainized. Okay, in what ways is the idea of diaspora shaped by digital media? Wow, huge question. I mean, this is that would be another lecture. I will say one quick thing, which is that there's this Facebook group that's gotten some attention in the past few years called Subtle Asian Traits. Does anybody know about this group? Okay, a few people do. And I actually gave a paper on subtle Asian traits at a conference a few years ago because I was so fascinated by the way this group uses the term Asian. It's like full of like silly memes and stuff like that, but it's like, are you even Asian if you don't? But then the things that are filled in are like so interesting. It's like, are you even Asian if you don't like drink boba, right? Like, are you even Asian if you don't? But see, this was one that didn't make sense a lot from a US point of view, was play badminton. Okay, so you all laughed, right? You all laughed. Like, if I said that to a bunch of Americans, they'd be like, what? Because that's not, that cliche like doesn't apply to Asian Americans as far as I can tell. So, and also subtle Asian traits comes from Australia. Like it was started by a bunch of Asian Australian students. And so it's kind of come across, sort of into this international space. So yes, digital media is absolutely a place where the idea of Asian is really being kind of navigated constantly. Okay, last one. How much is the Asian diasporic studies mainly Anglophone and American-centric, and how much is it reliant on translation? Okay. As a US-based English professor, I am absolutely guilty of focusing entirely on Anglophone work, on work written in English. That's in part because I'm interested in the particular formation of Asian diaspora that I'm interested in. I do think that thinking about work that's not written in English does change this dynamic a lot. But I don't tend to look at translated works. Again, that's just kind of because of my background and my training. But I do think that part of the reason I focus on these writers is that I do want to focus on this dynamic of kind of Asian immigrants within the sort of white majority society. So that's kind of my focus. Okay, I think I hit everything that was up there. So yeah, you want to, are there? Mhm. Yes. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for those questions. Yeah, I think for me, Cha is so important. I mean, Cha is important to me simply because I love her work and find it fascinating. And I think many people do, there's so much that's been kind of written and talked about her work. But at the same time, I think it still remains so elusive that like, I know I've written about Cha several times in my career, and I'm always dissatisfied with what I've said about her. I never feel like I've kind of grasped what is truly going on in her work. But I think that, to speak to your question of kind of like, what kinds of movements do we call diasporic, right? What's kind of included in that? Migration, exile, a sort of, all kinds of sort of transnational movements can be kind of incorporated within diaspora. I guess my concept of diaspora in a lot of ways, I mean, this is going to sound a little bit paradoxical because it's kind of sort of definitional in diaspora that it's about kind of displacement or movement. But actually, I think I'm as much interested in kind of connections among different diasporic communities as I am in the question of like, how did they get there exactly? So one thing I really looked at was like, how were Asian writers in the US, Canada, and Australia kind of being influenced by each other? Were they sort of communicating with each other? How were those connections working? In some cases, it seemed like there were very few connections. In other cases, it was clear that like there were very direct influences. I mean, Ouyang Yu talked constantly about kind of the example of Asian Americans and how he both was kind of like, almost sort of envious of Asian Americans for having accomplished so much and why can't we do that kind of thing in Australia? At the same time, he clearly didn't want to, and a lot of Australian writers I talked to said this, didn't want to simply kind of mimic or copy what was going on in the United States. So Asian American sort of literature was both a kind of inspiration for them, but also kind of like, okay, that's one example, but maybe we don't really want to do that. So I think that obviously there's a lot more to be said about like how did different populations sort of arrive there. I see diaspora as much about kind of how different communities that are kind of scattered around the world are connected to each other as much as it is about migration. So that's just a very quick way of answering your question, but thank you. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the question, and especially for those coming from outside the US context, the question of kind of racial terminology in the US is like so complex and it changes so rapidly and fluidly. Um, the use of, the question of like, are Asian Americans people of color, right? Like in the US. I mean, so yes, in the sense that people of color has come to be a sort of blanket term for basically anyone who's not white. Um, and that I think, I began hearing the term people of color in like, as early as like the 1980s or 1990s. Um, I would say that for most of the time, I've heard it over the past couple of decades, Asian Americans, at least in the academy, have been comfortable calling Asian Americans people of color, right? Um, at the same time, I do think that so in the US, I mean, this is really getting down to the weeds, right? But I mean, in the US, it's like that has happened to such an extent that some younger activists actually question the term people of color, including non-black people, because the term, I mean, some of you have probably heard the term BIPOC, BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, people of color, because some younger activists felt that people of color kind of lumped together Black folks, Latinos, Asian Americans too much, and that Blackness kind of needed to be foregrounded again in the term. So we've kind of looped all the way around to, people of color being very inclusive, to some people wanting to, sort of differentiate within it again. So, yeah, so I think people of color actually has been kind of in use as a term for Asian Americans for a while. But again, I think the whole question of like whether sort of regular old rank and file, like would my mother say that she's a person of color? I mean, I doubt it. But I don't know. Like I'll go home and ask her, but yeah, I think this terminology kind of shifts so rapidly in the US. And talking about social media, it's so driven by kind of social media discourse today that it's often hard to kind of track like what different how different terms function. But yeah, it's a great question.
Don't read it, but we're going to learn to get improver, because we've got a good level outside right now. And yeah, I don't know, take around the floor.
Thank you all so much.